Okay, so I am talking about the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which was in 1987. So, some history before this. A lot of times in the United States, there's a rise in homelessness when there's an economic depression. So the Great Depression and World War II kind of go together, and this was one of the main times when homelessness was a big issue in the country. During this time, people became homeless when they lost their jobs, or they came back from the war with PTSD. So then, in 1955, with deinstitutionalization, this was when antipsychotic medications were created, and so they were given to patients at psychiatric hospitals, and they were essentially sent away after given these medications. So they were sent away and expected to learn how to live on their own, and they left, especially patients who had been there for years, left with nothing. They didn't have anywhere to go, and they were struggling with a mental health disorder, so they were on the streets trying to figure out how to live and also suffering from this disorder. And then in 1956, there was a study done on Chicago's Skid Row, and they found that 1 out of 5 homeless men that they had interviewed had been suffering from a mental illness, and they came to the conclusion that for the homeless community, mental health was not a priority. They were more worried about where their next meal was going to come from or where they were going to stay that night. So they weren't really worried about their mental health by any means. And then in 1981 to 1988, there was a lot of federal funding cuts that did not help the homeless community. There was a decrease in the low-income housing, so people who maybe could have afforded low-income housing, the opportunity was taken away because there just wasn't any available. And then there was other cuts in the Social Security disability insurance, so people who were mentally ill and couldn't work were left without any money. They couldn't find ways to pay rent because they just weren't getting that extra income. So then the Homeless Person Survival Act was one of the first acts that was created to look at the homeless community, and a lot of it wasn't actually passed. There was only 3 main parts of it that were passed, and the first one was the Homeless Eligibility Clarification Act, and this removed requirements for permanent address when applying for things, so the homeless community can now apply for services such as supplemental security income, food stamps, and Medicaid without having an actual permanent address. And then the Homeless Housing Act provided grants for emergency shelters, so shelters could open up more beds and be available in crisis times for the homeless community. And then the Urgent Relief for the Homeless provided relief for these emergencies, and then it was actually renamed twice. So then that brings to the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, which is what it was renamed to. So it is the first and only legislative response to homelessness. Prior to this, the federal government decided that the homeless community was a problem that they didn't think needed intervention, so they weren't really going to do anything about it. So then when this act was created, it provided the homeless community with emergency shelters, transitional housing, job training, and then this included job training for veterans, healthcare, education, and permanent housing. So there's 9 titles in the act, and one of them defines homelessness, and then others provide education, healthcare, housing, and job training. And then Title VI actually has to do with the Department of Health and Human Services, and this provides healthcare for the homeless community. And then it also created community mental health services, mental health treatment services, and drug and alcohol abuse treatment. So the act was amended 4 different times. So in 1988, there was a modification to how they distributed the funds. They just kind of looked at where they could spend the funds better. And then in 1990, they added the Shelter Plus Care program, and this provided housing for people with disabilities, mental illness, and then drug and alcohol addictions. And then it also created projects for assistance in transition from homelessness, and this is just community mental health services. So there's more mental health businesses who are helping the homeless community. And then in 1992, safe havens were introduced, and then they also consolidated mental health services and alcohol and abuse treatment. And this created the Access to Community Care and Effective Services and Support Program. And this is just services for severely mentally ill people. So not just people who are suffering from like depression, but this also helps homeless people who are severely mentally ill. And then in 1994, there was just amendments to the educational side of the act. So then reactions to the act after it was passed, advocates portrayed homeless people as victims of mental illness, and they believed that they were deserving of the help and services that we were trying to provide them. They requested more emergency response for crisis times, and then they requested more funding and grants giving so that they could provide more services to the homeless community. And then critics of this viewed the homeless community as undeserving. They kind of just believed they were a waste of space and a waste of resources, and they wanted to drive them out of the cities. They just didn't really want them anywhere near them. So they really believed that they were undeserving of all of the services that we were trying to provide. So then the current state of homelessness and mental health, there was a study done, and in 1996, over 60% of long-term homeless people had experienced lifetime mental health problems, and then from 2005 to 2010, they found that 30% of these long-term homeless people had mental health conditions. So in the 10-15 years, it actually dropped by 30%, and then we do also see this with the substance abuse aspect of it. In 1996, 80% of long-term homeless people had suffered from substance abuse, and then in 2005 to 2010 it actually dropped to 50%. And then there are many nonprofit organizations and businesses that do provide mental health services to the homeless community now. And then just to wrap it all up, I kind of wanted to show just some local resources. So the Hope Street of Siouxland Mental Health Center, and then Transitional Services of Iowa, which is also a Family Access Center. They provide free mental health counseling with Medicaid, or they offer reduced pricing for mental health services. And then Community Action Agency actually provides funding for people, so if they need help with rent or any sort of bills, they can apply, and Community Action Agency will offer them those resources. Any questions? Yes.
So kind of what I'm understanding from this act is that it wasn't really providing housing, it was just providing services and then a way of payment, is that?
It kind of focused on a lot of things, so it did provide housing, but I focused more on the mental health aspect of it. So it did provide like housing and that kind of stuff, but it also provided other sources for mental health. Yes?
What do you think is the biggest problem facing homeless people today? Is it like the housing situation, like lack of job abilities or opportunities, or mental health?
I think it is still mental health. I think that study from Chicago Skid Row, I think they are still worried about like where they're gonna stay the night or where they're gonna get their next meal. So, I mean, there's resources out there, but I still think that's not necessarily a priority that they're taking care of, so, yes.
What suggestions would you make then to like continue like making improvements?
I think just advocating for like the local resources that we have. I don't know how many people in the homeless community actually know about these resources, so maybe just making them more aware of like they do have these resources available to them. So.
And that's all the time we have for questions.